Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to today's presentation on training yourself to be more creative, a design thinking seminar. Again, I'm Bill Burnett, the Executive Director of the Design Program, and I want to walk you through what I think are sort of the three easiest ways to train yourself to be more creative. There's one of the writers in the creativity field for years and years and years is a guy named Edward de Bono, and I love this expression: you can't dig a new hole by digging an old one deeper. And so what we're going to do is teach you to dig some new holes. Design thinking, just to give you a little bit of a background, started here at Stanford. We've been teaching design in this integrated program between the art and the engineering schools for about 50 years exactly this year. 1963 was the first time the Board of Trustees at Stanford granted us permission to give out a degree, which was a joint degree between engineering and art. And so we've been exploring this multidisciplinary field for quite a long time. And one of the graduates of this program and one of our sort of famous guys is David Kelly. He's both the founder of IDEO, probably the world's foremost innovation consulting firm, and a professor here at Stanford, where he also founded our new design institute. Well, new, it's now 6 years old, the D School. And if you have an opportunity, go check out David's TED Talk on creative confidence. The link is there. But if you just Google David Kelly TED Talk, you'll get his talk on creative confidence. And he just quoted saying, design thinking is all about unlocking potential and creating creative confidence in our students. And one of our ideas is that creativity is sort of typically innate in people, but it has been poorly realized or poorly trained. And we've been working for the last 50 years here at Stanford, and certainly for the last 6 in the D School, with this idea about design thinking to re-enable people's creativity. So design thinking is both a process and a mindset. It's a way of approaching problem solving, but like everybody, we have a process diagram. I wouldn't get too hung up on it, other than it kind of starts with a couple of interesting ideas. One is that we don't start our design process with specifications or research or things like that. We start our design process with empathy. Empathy for the users we're designing for. This is different than traditional forms of market research or things. This involves using the tools of anthropology and ethnography to study users in their activities to understand what they're really up against in terms of problem solving. And then to find the problem, we do lots and lots of techniques around coming up with lots of ideas, ideation. And we believe that because the problems we're working on are so difficult, they can't really be solved in a traditional way. We build lots and lots of prototypes and test things with users. It's really a co-creation process in some ways. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on the ideate bubble here, but I wanted to just give you a background on the overall process before we get into the ideas of how to make yourself more creative. Again, to sort of just quickly brief on design thinking, it's a very dynamic approach to problem solving, and it works best on problems that are called poorly bounded problems, or problems where you really can't get a lot of data. Things about the future of the automobile, or the future of the computer, or the smartphone. There's no way to really look into the future and get data. So you need to use other techniques. We talk about ourselves not solving problems or making decisions, but rather building our way forward. So we use prototyping for rapid learning and improvement. And we use lots and lots of different ways to solve problems, because we believe if you're choosing from a small set of solutions, you'll choose poorly. But if you choose from a large set, which is what we're going to be talking about in terms of your personal creativity, you have a better chance of having a good outcome. Actually, we won't talk that much about the empathy phase, but that's really what unlocks innovation in some ways more than anything else in our process, because design thinking is really not only an approach to problem solving, it's an approach to problem finding. Most of the time, people are working on the wrong problem in our experience. And so we find that the highest leverage in innovation is sort of in reframing what the problem is actually about, and that's where we use our empathic observations, and ethnography techniques and prototyping techniques to provoke a real understanding of the latent needs involved in whatever problem we're working on. And then, we think it's a pretty much a new perspective on how you create value either for yourself or in an organization. It's this co-creation process focused on real user needs, and it's a very human-centered process. So typically, the solutions that come out of it are not only innovative, but pretty action-driven or action in the world driven. So, as I said, that's an overview of design thinking. But today, I really want to focus on this ideate bubble, or a hexagon, I guess, in this case. And ideation covers all of the techniques we use to have lots and lots and lots of ideas. Because, again, there's a lot of evidence that says if you choose from your first idea or your second idea or just a few ideas, you're typically choosing in a very small and very confined problem space. But if you step back and brainstorm, ideate, mind map, do morphological analysis, do improv, do lots of other techniques that we teach, you're going to generate a very rich field of potential solutions. And from there, you will choose potentially better and more innovative solutions. So how do we become great ideators? Or in another way of looking at it is, like, why is this even a problem? What is this whole thing about creativity? People talk a lot about creativity and innovation. They talk a lot about, sort of a lack of new ideas in the business world today. And certainly as the environment changes and the external circumstances changes, either for yourself or for the organizations you work in, people are being asked to come up with new solutions and be creative, which is kind of like your track coach saying, run faster. How the heck do you do that, right? So what is this creativity problem anyway? The ability to transcend traditional ideas and create meaningful new ideas is one definition. So I'd like to just sort of dive into this a little bit, but before we do that, I want to take a quick poll. Here's a slide. And then my question to you is, were you more creative as a child than, let's say, you are today? However you want to judge creativity, whatever it means to you, were you more creative as a child than you are today? Okay. Looks like we're sort of stabilized here. We have about 270 people voting. You want to close the poll? Okay, looks like about half of you, 49% of you say, yeah, I was much more creative as a child. 25% of you say, yeah, I was a little bit more creative when I was a kid. So 75% of you are thinking maybe today something isn't quite as good as it used to be when you were 5 or 6 or 7 or whenever you decided you were a child. And about 24, 25% of you are saying, no, I think today I'm more creative. It'd be interesting to dive into what that means for people, but I think in general when I've done this poll in lots of different seminars and lots of different workshops, it breaks down about the same way. About, 70, 80% of the people say, yeah, I feel like something is missing in me today that I had as a kid. When I was a child, I was 5 or 6 or 7, and I was playing. I could invent magical worlds. I could, a rock could be a truck, and a stick could be a, sword, and I could invent almost any sort of solutions to any problems that I had. And I would argue that that is really, kind of the pure creativity that many of us are born with. And then something happens, and mostly what happens is our education system, which promotes a massive fear of failure and a search for only one right idea. And then there's always, if you listen to David Kelly's talk, he talks about a friend of his growing up in Ohio, and they were in art class in first or second grade, and they were making stuff out of clay, and he made a horse, and the girl next to him said, "That doesn't look like a horse. That's a horrible horse." And of course, his creativity at that point was crushed because what he felt, was a beautiful thing had been judged to be not art. So probably many of us had that experience where somebody told us, hey, you're not creative, or you're not an artist, or you can't write, or you can't sing, whatever it was, and, that kind of put that first ding in our creative confidence. And then a series of educational experiences where our creativity, curiosity, whatever, was scrunched a bit when we tried to do something outside the box or outside of the command and control system that is the experience most of us had with education. But other than the social experience we've had, I want to dive a little deeper into what is actually going on in our brain around this creativity thing. And I want to introduce you to a new field called neural Darwinianism. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about neuroscience and what we know about the brain. And I want to first preface that by saying that when I was going to school, we talked about left brain and right brain. And some of you probably remember the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, and there was all these books about right side of the brain. Robert Ornstein, the professor here at Stanford who originally did that research, has since written a book talking about how frustrated he is that everybody misunderstood his research about left and right brains. But I think that was it was an incorrect model, as we now know from more brain research, but it was useful because it did sort of break down a way of thinking about two modes that we operate in, a creative mode and an analytic mode. We have new brain research, and I will argue that it is probably incorrect as well, but useful. And one of the more interesting and useful ideas is this notion that the brain, like all the other parts of our body, was subject to evolutionary pressures. It's not just the intact animal that has to evolve in the world. It's all the parts of the animal, including our brain in our case, that evolve. And in this case, it evolves through resource competition to process information at the lowest possible energy state. Now, there's a picture here of a brain and a 40-watt light bulb. The brain operates somewhere between 20 and 60 watts, depending on what you're doing. But as an average, we think, from the research that we have, the brain operates on about 40 watts of continuous output power. So what's interesting about that is the laptop I'm doing this presentation on has got an 80-watt processor. The Watson computer that won Jeopardy runs at about 360,000 watts. And none of them, these computers can't fall in love. They can't write a poem. They can't, become a president or create a company. They're really rather limited in what they can do. They can do, rote calculations very, very much more quickly than the human brain. But the human brain is really an amazing processor. And yet it had to, because it was competing for resources with the rest of the body, it can't take all the energy. You consume a couple thousand calories, a day typically, and a substantial portion of that goes to running your brain because your brain's such a critical organ in the function of a human being. But 40 watts, think about it. That's nothing. So how the heck did the brain evolve structures so that it could work at such low and efficient energies? Well, this is some work from Dan Goleman and Don Norman in a book called The Psychology of Self-Deception. Dan Goleman, you might recognize the name. He's the guy who wrote the book on emotional intelligence. And he and Don Norman are cognitive psych guys, and they've been studying the brain. And by doing a bunch of different exercises, we've kind of teased out a basic, I'd call it a block diagram of how the brain works. So we think we have stimulus. We have our five senses, and things come into our sight, our hearing, our smell, touch, taste, and we think we kind of just respond to what we see and what we hear. But it turns out it's really not that at all, because the input bandwidth of the sensors is a flood of information that if we were processing all of it all the time, the brain would have to be 10 or 20 times more power hungry than it is. So really what happens is that stuff gets sort of quickly censored and filtered. There's a lot more intelligence in your body than just the brain. Lots of things are pre-processed on the optic nerve path before it ever gets to the brain for image recognition. Lots of things are pre-processed in your sense of touch as well, so that you can, if you think about how gymnasts and athletes and other people can move with what they call muscle memory, it's actually a combination of muscles and nerves registering the position of their body in space, and then it reacts without direct processing by the brain. But for the stuff that we're talking about, today, having good ideas and being creative, what happens is you see all this stuff, it gets censored and filtered a little bit, and it gets thrown up into the unconscious part of your brain. I'm just going to say the part that is you're not verbally aware of, you don't have any consciousness of. And it's sorted by what psychologists call schemas. The schemas, you have a schema for everything. You have a schema for chair, you have a schema for shoe, a schema for dog, a schema for man. And actually there's a schema for faces, and then there's a neural path that encodes the face of a friend or the face of your wife. And after the first few times you see something, it takes quite a bit of processing to recognize it. But after a while, and not too long, you've evolved very, very short, very, very rapid neural paths that encode the information about these things. So these thousands and thousands, maybe millions of schemas that are in your unconscious brain. And then what happens is in this little section called pre-consciousness, there's a little prediction engine that runs, and it loads up the schemas that it thinks you're going to need. And then consciousness turns out to be really aware of about 1/100,000th of the processing that's going on in your brain. This is not that your brain is, it's not that you only use 1/10 of your brain. You use all of your brain all of the time. But what you can bring into consciousness, what you're aware of through verbal and conscious activity, is really a tiny, tiny fraction. And that's it to enable the brain to work at a very, very low energy level. I'll give you an example of a schema. So here's a schema that's sort of was a cultural schema, if you will. It was considered impossible for a human being to run a 4-minute mile. And many doctors, psychologists, physiologists said it's not possible. Humans can't run that fast. And there was even a claim that if they ran that fast, they wouldn't be able to breathe because the air would be moving so quickly. And, of course, none of that turned out to be true. And 25-year-old Roger Bannister, who was an English medical student who trained a couple days a week, ran the first 4-minute mile, ran under 4 minutes on May 6, 1954. So the schema prior to Roger's 4-minute mile was this is impossible. And runners constantly came up against this barrier and were defeated. For whatever reason, Roger was able to unleash that schema, not be governed by that. He went beyond that and ran the first 4-minute mile. Then, of course, as soon as that had happened, the schema was, a 4-minute mile can be run by a human. It is possible. 16 runners ran it in the next 18 months, and now well over 1,000 runners have run better than this. In fact, I have a student on the track team here who regularly clocks 3:58 as his time, and he's not even, top 10 NC2A anymore. So one of the things I think I want to start thinking about is how are you chunking or schematizing information? Because what happens with these schemas is, what the psychologists say is, we don't really see what we're looking at. We only see what we're looking for. And so one of the things that happens to folks when they get in a rut or they not train their creativity is they're stuck in schematic thinking where they're really only seeing solutions that they're looking for. Now, the interesting solution to that is to just change the way you schematize information. We'll talk about how you do that in a second. The other thing that's really kind of startling is that consciousness, this thing that we're aware of, only 1/100,000th of all the information that's actually being processed, consciousness turns out to be only 300 milliseconds long. The way we know this, unfortunately, is that there are people who have had different parts of their brain damaged by tumors or seizures or other things. And what we know now is that the brain is organized, into there's consciousness, short-term memory, and long-term memory. There have been people who have had a tumor or something and have no long-term memory. So we know that short-term memory is roughly 7 to 10 minutes long. If anyone ever saw the movie Memento, that was a main character, had no long-term memory. He only had a 7 to 10 minute memory buffer. And so after every 10 minutes, he didn't know who he was talking to anymore, and he had to start the conversation again. But unfortunately, there have been several patients, one well-studied, who had neither short-term nor long-term memory, and they live in a kind of a very difficult space of about 300, less than half a second of ability to sort of grasp and store what they see and are aware of. And so we know from those studies that consciousness is really only 300 milliseconds long. So where's this going? Well, all right, so consciousness is 300 milliseconds long. We all have good short-term and long-term memory, although my short-term memory is sliding a bit as I get older. But given that we've got this scheme where we grasp the information in the world in our conscious thinking in 300 milliseconds, throw it into short-term memory, and if it's important and it needs to be encoded, then becomes part of our long-term memory. What it tells us is that really what we're doing is we're creating a movie, frame by frame, of what we see. And the way we put the movie together is our schemas. We have a pre-consciousness buffer in our brain that's taking all the things that are possible and making predictions about what will come next. And that's how we tie together a consistent image of our existence. So our consciousness is 300 milliseconds, our short-term memory is 7 minutes, our long-term memory goes forever, as far as we know. And that's how we construct our reality. It's not an objective reality in the sense that the reality is actually there. It's just the reality we choose to perceive. I have a good friend who says, if you don't like reality, just change your mind. But in a fundamental way, that's sort of true. Now, I'm going a little deeper on this, because I just want to make sure we've got a framework. The other findings on creativity, and there we have some measurements. We have certain psychometric tools that you can measure people, and you can kind of say, well, these folks over here gave more creative responses than these folks here. So if you measure high creatives and you then put them in a brain scanner and you give them different tasks to do, we discover 3 things that are statistically significant about them. One, they actually perceive the world differently. When you show them pictures of things, different parts of their visual cortex light up than other people. They see things more richly, or they see things more precisely, but they see things differently, and they actually have a higher tactile response, which is interesting. We don't understand why this is true, but they're just more sensitive to the world in some way. They also have a high social awareness response, which is this empathy thing. Many creative people are quite introverted, so I'm not saying that they're social. They just observe, and most introverts, in fact, observe the world very carefully because they want to keep the world at a distance and they don't want to interact with it, so they become very good observers. They have high empathy for the people in the world. And so, you could teach yourself to be a little more visually aware and more tactically aware just through sensitivity training. You could train your empathy to be more deep for other people and for other conditions. But the one that's really interesting, because it reveals that creativity is not something extra you have, it's actually a deficit. People with who measure highly creative on psychometric tools have a low fear response to novelty. When you show them pictures of things they've never seen before, they should react with a fear response. Their amygdala should light up, a little cortisol should flow, adrenaline should flow. This makes sense. Evolution would have, you're walking through the jungle and something pops out you've never seen before. You should respond with a reaction to back away. Interestingly, high creative people have a low or no fear response to novelty. Well, the most interesting thing about that is this is totally learnable. In David Kelly's talk, he talks about a psychologist, a very famous psychologist here at Stanford, who's still teaching, Albert Bandura. He's well into his 80s. He's the person who studied phobias and developed a very simple desensitization technique to teach people to get over their phobias. And within a very short period of time, if you're terrified of snakes or spiders, he can have you holding snakes and letting spiders crawl in your arm. It's a completely learnable trait to lower your fear response to novelty. By the way, the other word for this deficit is called creativity. And curiosity. People who see something unusual and instead of going, ooh, what's that, go, what's that? It's the yes and response we find in improv that's so liberating. So a low fear response to novelty can easily be learned. And I think if you look back to the very first question I asked you, why were you more creative as a child? When you were a child, you did not fear, you didn't know, therefore you did not fear judgments about your ideas, criticisms about your behaviors. You were more open and more free because you were still kind of undamaged by the social and educational pressures that would come later. And so you were truly curious. It also turns out that evolution doesn't like a lot of curious people, a lot of low fear response to novelty people. It would be evolutionarily advantageous if a tribe or an organization of humans thought the same way, believed the same things, and followed the same patterns. And so if you have a tribe of folks and they always hunt for the buffalo out on the plains and the buffalo are always there, you don't want people, disturbing that. That would be not evolutionarily advantageous. Until, of course, the climate changes or the situation changes, and then there's no more buffaloes out on the plains, and you go 1 year and there's no buffalo, so the tribe gets together and does the rituals and shakes the beads, and the next year there's still no buffalo, and the next year there's still no buffalo. It would be, at that point, highly advantageous to have one of those crazy people in the tribe go, hey, when you guys go over there looking for buffalo, I go over here to this other place, and there's a ton of wildebeests. And, I ate one, and it was pretty good. Anybody want to go over here with me? So you need people who are highly creative, and we think, in terms of this deficit, this brain deficit, it's only maybe 5 to 10% of the population evolved this way. But they would be useful if you were trying to do, say something different. And so then the good news is creativity is not something you're born with. It's actually something you're born without. But that thing, the deficit, can easily be trained. So let's talk about, how we're in a box. It's just true. Our brains schematize things in order to run at at very low energy levels. We have to be this way because evolution created us this way. It is the most efficient processor that we know of in the universe to create intelligence. But it does work a very specific way, which is sort of the opposite of the way we want to work when we're trying to be creative. So here are the big ideas, or I call them the liberating ideas. The box is real, so don't worry about it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you. If you have a healthy brain, it's working very efficiently at 20 or 30 or 40 watts and is getting you through the day by ignoring 1/100,000th of the evidence, and then the processing that's actually going on, and just giving you the things you need to know and need to see when you need them. So creativity is probably a brain deficit, not a brain special thing, which is, I think, a big yay, fantastic. And, we can all learn to be less smart, less fearful. That's easy. And that creativity is actually a very high energy brain behavior. When we put people in scanners and we give them hard problems to solve, and they have these little moments of revelation, or we call them aha moments, their whole brain lights up. Literally, their whole brain lights up, and it powers up to a very, very high energy level, which you couldn't sustain for very long. I don't know about you, but after a lot of creative work or brainstorming sessions or strategy sessions, my brain's a little tired, right? It gets kind of numb. So it's true that it's a high energy brain behavior. It's not normal, but it can be learned. And you can train yourself by lowering your fear of failure, learning to utilize schemas, not against you, but for you, manipulating schemas in order to trick your brain into creative behaviors. And you can also access your improvisational and other intelligences in ways that I'm going to talk about right now. Okay, enough with the sort of deep brain stuff. Back to this ideation problem. I'm going to give you 3 things you can do that I think are pretty actionable, a little bit maybe contrary to common sense in some ways, but very actionable, and things that you can do to train yourself to be more creative. Number 1, I want you to train yourself to get stuck. Now, this sounds a little weird, but let me explain it to you. There's a great book on personal creativity. I still use it. It was written back in the 70s, but it's been updated a bunch of times. James Adams, who's a professor emeritus here at Stanford now, wrote a book called Conceptual Blockbusting, A Guide to Better Ideas. Highly recommend Jim's book. It's a fantastic book. It's full of exercises and theory and very practical things that you can do. It's very good for personal creativity. And he has an exercise in there that I've run thousands of times all over the world. It's called the 30 circles exercise. And you can do the same exercise with a paper clip or any object. Just basically take something common like a circle and make it into something. and then you demand a high number of ideas, 100 ideas for a paperclip, 30 different things you can do with a circle. It's a great exercise because it's so simple. You can run it with a piece of paper and a pen and a willing audience, and everybody gets stuck. They run out of ideas in the first 15 seconds or 20 seconds. And they do that because I kind of trick them and I do some other things to put them in the box. And so what I like about it is it creates this getting stuck feeling. And what most of us do when we get stuck is we don't identify the feeling. We don't like it because it feels like failure. And so our fear and failure, filters start operating. And then we immediately want to do something else. Instead of staying in the stuck place, we want to go do our email, or we want to, do the budgets or something. But anything looks better than stuck. But almost everybody has a moment where they go, well, let's see, baseball, I can make it a baseball, I can make it a soccer ball, I can make it something else. And those are all things you could do inside the circle. And then they go, hey, wait a minute, I could make it a daisy, I could make it a sunflower, I could make, And we have what we call an aha moment. And that moment, I'm totally stuck, and oh, wow, I have a whole bunch of new ideas. That little moment, I don't know how many milliseconds it takes to cross that barrier, but something happens, and their brain goes from no activity to tons of activity. I'm sure if we put them in a scanner, it would light up like a Christmas tree, and there's a burst of endorphins, and there's a burst of dopamine, and your brain feels good, and you like that feeling. So I want you to train yourself to get stuck and be aware of where you feel stuck in your body. Because if I was once doing a workshop with a bunch of financial services people, and these were bankers, and a banker came up to me at the lunch break, and he said, I did that exercise, I just got stuck and I gave up. I'm not creative, I just get stuck. And I said, well, you don't understand. I get stuck hundreds of times a day. I'm always doing things I don't know how to do. That's the nature of design. It's not about getting stuck. It's about what you do with it. And actually, being stuck is a gift, because I know from experience that right on the other side of stuck, that 100 milliseconds later, is my aha moment. And so you want to challenge yourself with problems you don't know how to solve. And you don't want to stay stuck too long, because it is actually a very uncomfortable feeling. But you want to challenge yourself to get to that stuck place, and then see if you can release yourself, right? Because the stuck is the schema you're working with right now no longer has any ideas left in it. When you run out of all the things to do with a circle that's inside the circle, there's just no more things. I don't know any more answers after I do all the baseballs and basketballs and everything else. Smiley faces, sad faces. But once I get to the outside the circle schema, flowers, sunshine, blah, 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 and then two circles can be, eyeglasses, wheels in the bus, blah, blah, blah. And you just keep going and going and going. And once you know that you can manipulate the schemas, and that stuck is actually your friend, it's the feeling in your brain that's saying, there's no more ideas here, go look somewhere else. Then you get released, then you have that aha moment. And I'll tell you, I think designers are just junkies for that moment where they have a good idea, because it does release really happy chemicals in your brain, and we actually seek being stuck. So train yourself to find that moment, and then stay there in it, and understand that stuck is just one short millisecond away from that aha. Number two. Everybody brainstorms. Most people I watch brainstorm very poorly. I want you to train yourself to brainstorm well. This is the most used and most abused tool I see in personal creativity and group creativity. People say they're brainstorming, but when I watch them doing it, I have no idea what it is, but it ain't a brainstorm. Not the way I frame it anyway. And when you brainstorm, here's the reframe for you. Here's the define part of our model, where we redefine the problem. I don't want you to think about brainstorming, having ideas. I want you to think about jazz. I want you to think about making beautiful music. When a jazz ensemble gets together, it's not about doing the same thing they've done before. It's about doing something completely different. So you wouldn't expect to sit in with Miles Davis, from the Miles Davis Sextet on the Kind of Blue album, which is the sort of best-selling album of all time in jazz. It was the breakthrough album for Miles, with the most amazing, John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, Bill Evans, Jimmy Cobb, Paul Chambers. You wouldn't sit in with them and say, I'm going to play jazz with you guys if it was the first time you'd ever picked up a saxophone, or even, you'd only had, 10 or 20 hours of lessons on a saxophone. Because to play jazz at that level requires an amazing amount of skill. Well, it's the same thing with brainstorming. You don't just show up and say, oh, I know how to do this. Here's my saxophone. I'll play music with you guys. You have to practice. And the mechanics of brainstorming are surprisingly difficult. And even after you get the mechanics right, even if you can play scales on your saxophone, that doesn't mean you can play jazz. Brainstorming is a complex interaction of conscious and unconscious effects that occur verbally and non-verbally between people who are truly engaged in the moment of trying to make something that they've never made before. And it's partly this 10,000-hour problem. There's this theory that it takes 10,000 hours to get to mastery at anything. Well, it takes about 1,000 hours to move from competent to expert, and it takes at least 100 hours to move from novice to competent. So although everybody thinks they know how to brainstorm, this mastering the art of being right in the moment and having ideas one after the other and having unique and exciting ideas and going wide and going crazy, this inventing in the moment, how many of you have actually practiced 100 hours on your instrument, your brain, to trigger schematic-free thinking, to trigger the ability to move quickly and frictionlessly between idea to idea, to work off of the other person's offering? Somebody says, let's do this, and you say, let's do that. And somebody says, let's do this, and you immediately have the next idea. This kind of competency in what I call, jazz thinking or brainstorming thinking is something you have to work hard at. I was taught brainstorming by the guy who invented our program back in 1976. I added up the hours. I'm at about 9,500 hours. And it's got to be, just getting a saxophone and making sounds is not practicing, right? You have to actually do this well. In fact, it's worse to just practice brainstorming poorly. So you want to do it well. Actually, I had the opportunity to be studied in a brain study on brainstorming, and I've almost gotten to frictionless brain. Not quite. I still make a lot of mistakes because this is a mind-body problem, right? This is how do you get your brain out of its own way? How do you integrate all of your intelligence, emotional intelligence, physical intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, the facts and figures that you know, and really create something new and in the moment? And there's two things I want to teach you about brainstorming that will make your brainstorming much better. When you come into a brainstorming session, you're typically coming from your analytic side. You just came from the budget meeting, or you're doing schedules, or you're doing emails or something. And now you need to move to your synthesis side. You need to have a moment where you calm down and get present with the problem that you're going to solve. And this is prompted by warming up. What I see all the time, would an athlete run a mile without stretching first? No, you pull a muscle. I see people jumping into brainstorms as if, they couldn't pull a conceptual muscle. They don't warm up. I'll give you a fantastic, we steal a lot from improv. We had a wonderful professor here at Stanford named Patricia Ryan who who taught improv for 30 years here. Her protege, Dan Klein, is now teaching it, and we use Dan all the time in our workshops to help people brainstorm better. And he warms them up by using a lot of games from the improv world. Right? In improvisation, much like brainstorming, you have to be ready in the moment to create. There's always an offering from your partner, and there's always a yes and. And we use a game called Sound Ball, where you throw an imaginary ball around making sounds. We use a game called Proverbs, where people just say random words in a sentence, and eventually wisdom emerges. And there's another wonderful game that Dan's taught us called Remember That Time When, where and that's the lead. You just say, remember that time when we went fishing, and then the next person says, yeah, and we caught this giant salmon. And he said, yeah, and it was funny because it wasn't in salt water. And yeah, and this is the weirdest salmon I ever saw. It was purple. It's purple salmon. And you just keep going. these games teach you to start the free association process. They relax the analytic side of your brain and let the synthesis and the verbal, playful side of your brain warm up and emerge, and it creates much better brainstorming sessions. Elizabeth Gerber, who's a former master's student of mine, then she went on to get a PhD, studied this. She's now at Northwestern University. She's the person who started the Design for America program. She's really quite an accomplished young academic, and she's put up a site because she studied improv and brainstorming as part of her research. The site's www.betterbrainstorms.com. It's full of these tools. I would highly, if you do nothing else, go to that site, learn 1 or 2 ways to warm your teams up, warm yourself up before you start, and you'll have much better outcomes. The other thing that we find is that people typically, after they've done a big brainstorm, they either don't sort their ideas or they sort them poorly. They sort them by what's feasible. What can we actually do, which gets you back to the first 3 ideas you ever had. We suggest sorting instead by potential because we believe that potential can always, you can always develop feasibility out of high potential ideas. And we have a bunch of different ways of sorting ideas, but I think you just want to be mindful of selecting differently. So if in the beginning you warm up better, you'll have a good brainstorm, and then if you select your ideas differently rather than sorting for potential rather than what's doable, you'll prompt yourself to think more creatively about the possibilities. So brainstorming will, in fact, transform you as a creative person. The data shows that novices with poor setup and poor follow-through, poor warm-up and poor sorting get bad results. But you have to be good enough at your instrument, your brain, to create in the moment. So you've got to get at least 100 hours of really focused brainstorming. And we suggest the ways to improve your brainstorming output is to warm up with improv games and select ideas for potentials. And then finally, space. Not this kind of space, but the kind of space you work in. We have a very strong correlation around the D-School. We've completely rebuilt our teaching spaces. We designed our own spaces. They're unlike anything at the university, and they're some of the most engaged and attractive spaces, and everybody wants to use them because they don't look like this. Space creates behavior. You've all been probably students at some time when you walk into a room and all the seats are bolted to the floor and they're facing a chalkboard with a little stage. You know what's going to happen. You're going to come in, sit down, you're going to be lectured at. It's time to turn off your brain and open up your laptop. For my students, you open up your laptop, get on Facebook, open 2 chat windows, get on Google Hangouts, and ignore whatever's going on stage. So this kind of behavior is prompted by the physical space, and it's not a very creative behavior. Here's what the spaces look like in a D-School teaching room. There is no front, there is no back. There are lots of whiteboards. There's Post-its all over the place. All the furniture's on wheels. The room can be completely reconfigured on the fly depending on what the activities are. And when the student who's never been in a D-School classroom before enters this space, they have no idea what behaviors are expected, other than it's not going to be like other classrooms they've been in. And we see over and over again the impact that space has on your state of mind. There is a big Harvard study that was done about space, 36,000 scientific papers that were ranked as highly innovative, and one of the outcomes of that was there was a building, old building at MIT where all the good research was done. So it was just a scrappy old warehouse that nobody was supposed to use, but it got repositioned as lab spaces. And it was a very raw and modifiable environment, and that seemed to have a significant impact on the output of the researchers. So we would suggest you create some kind of a war room in your own home or some kind of place, even a corner of a room, where is your creative space. Put stuff up on the walls, put pictures up, make information about the problems you're working on or the ideas that you're having persistent. I think this is what Pinterest is all about. Pinterest is like creating a virtual creative space on the net for your thinking. Remove all status clues. In our environment, we remove the sage-on-stage effect of the professor at the front of the room. Any kind of status stuff defeats creativity. Make your space self-authoring so that it can automatically morph into the space you need it to be for a creative act. So if you're building something, or you're modeling something, or you're drawing, or you're writing, or you're thinking, the space should reflect your state of mind, not the other way around. Two good references on this: the New Yorker article that talks about the information about MIT's raw space and how space seems to change the behavior of researchers, and a book two guys at the D School wrote called Making Space, about creating creative spaces might be useful as you think about changing that. So my takeaways real quickly, and maybe we'll have a couple of minutes for questions. Changing yourself is really all about changing your behaviors. It's not about changing what's going on in your brain, because you have very little control over that. But you can change the way you behave. Three powerful methods to make yourself more creative would be to get stuck more often, move to a jazz brainstorming model, and create a space somewhere in your home or wherever you work that demands these new behaviors. And, model the behavior you want. If you act differently, you will think differently. And reward yourself for being different. If nobody else will, make sure you give yourself rewards for acting in a different way. And by the way, it takes about 8 weeks to establish a new habit. Say that at least 8 weeks, for me, much longer sometimes. But the cognitive psych guys say it takes about 8 weeks to ingrain a new behavior. So you need to behave this way for about 8 weeks before you start to feel this way. And I'll leave you with the Gandhi quote: "Be the change you want to see in the world," which, in addition to global, talks about what you have to do inside to be the kind of person you want. So if you want to be more creative, get stuck more often, brainstorm better, and carve out a space in the world where your creativity is nurtured. One question is, what are your thoughts on websites like Lumosity, which uses games to exercise the brain? I actually have two of my senior students doing their senior project with Lumosity. They're inventing a new methodology for brain training that involves music and rhythm. I think there's actually quite a bit of evidence in there, and they're gathering quite a bit. They have about 30 or some 40 million users playing these different games to exercise the brain. My guess is, so I would think that they're valuable. I think they're great, certainly as warm-up exercises for creativity. I think some of those exercises are designed around exercising, choice and rational thought, so they push you more into the analytic side than the creative side of your thinking. But in general, I think it's probably pretty valuable stuff. I think if I don't know if it keeps your brain more nimble longer, but I don't think there's any way it could hurt. Another question, Bandura's research was specifically about reducing fears to reducing phobias, and they had very specific outcomes. You have fear of spiders, fear of snakes, fear of flying. And is it possible to overcome the generalized fear of failure? I think it is, but I don't think you do it that way. For instance, when we do brainstorming, the one rule that really matters is no critique, right? And the reason you do the no critique rule, that everybody has to accept every idea that's put out there, no matter how crazy, even if it's off topic, whatever, is in order to create a safe place where you can learn to freely exercise your creativity without worrying about being criticized. But what really happens in brainstorming is that you self-criticize. You fail to flush out an interesting possible solution because you've already edited it in your pre-consciousness, and so you're not aware of that solution. So when you practice, I think you lower fear of failure by doing very specific practices. In the case of brainstorming, you not only create an environment where you're not criticizing others, you're learning to not self-criticize ideas, because the true fear of failure is inside. It's not really in the group. Probably most people have a hard enough shell at this point that if somebody criticizes an idea, they can keep having it. But it's more about the internal critic that's running almost unconsciously. So the more you practice brainstorming, the more, and you do it well, and you learn to say the embarrassing idea. You learn to throw out the thing that everybody looks kind of quizzically at when you first say it. And you reward yourself for that behavior. You will lower that fear of failure, and that fear of failure in a specific context will then help you lower your fear in a more general context. I think you want to practice, you want to, be the change you want to see in the world. You want to model that type of fearless behavior for yourself, for your friends, for others, because when people reflect back to you, wow, that was a really crazy idea, or wow, you really seem to be, on today. What they're really doing is just saying that you look like a different person. You're behaving a different way. So you'll know that your fear of failure is under control or dropping in a general sense when you're able to behave in very specific situations, a brainstorm, a group meeting, even in a meeting where people have to come up with analyze a hard decision, and you're the one saying, let's reframe this and look at it differently. You'll know that that's all of those practices are very specific ways of overcoming a general sense of fear of failure. Let's see. Is it true that the physically handicapped think more creatively? I don't know. I'm not so that I've heard that before. I think what happens to, for instance, people who are born blind or who are blind early in life remap the visual portions of the brain to other senses because it's just not necessary for the visual sense. And about 50–60% of our brain is processing visual information all the time. And so you hear stories of folks who are blind who have acute sense of hearing, acute sense of smell, acute sense of touch. I think they've just remapped the processing that have been taken up by sight. But I don't know that there's any studies about other physical handicaps or physical handicaps in general creating more creativity. I think the folks that I know, I happen to have a good friend of mine who's in a wheelchair, and he's just highly creative about how he gets around the world, but that's more from necessity. He's also one of the best dancers I've ever met. He's working with a different set of tools, but he's figuring out how to make it work. So I think it may be that, there's some stories around that, but I don't know that we have any evidence or studies. If anyone knows of anything about that that's been in the literature, I'd love to know. And one of our ideas is that creativity is just sort of typically innate in people, but it has been poorly realized or poorly trained. And we've been working for the last 50 years here at Stanford, and certainly for the last 6 in the D School, with this idea about design thinking to re-enable people's creativity. So design thinking is both a process and a mindset. It's a way of approaching problem solving, but like everybody, we have a process diagram. I wouldn't get too hung up on it, other than it kind of starts with a couple of interesting ideas. One is that we don't start our design process with specifications or research or things like that. We start our design process with empathy. Empathy for the users we're designing for. This is different than traditional forms of market research or things. This involves using the tools of anthropology and ethnography to study users in their activities to understand what they're really up against in terms of problem solving. And then we define the problem. We do lots and lots of techniques around coming up with lots of ideas, ideation. And we believe that because the problems we're working on are so difficult, they can't really be solved in a traditional way. We build lots and lots of prototypes and test things with users. It's really a co-creation process in some ways. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on the ideate bubble here, but I wanted to just give you a background in the overall process before we get into the ideas of how to make yourself more creative. Again, to sort of just quickly brief on design thinking, it's a very dynamic approach to problem solving, and it works best on problems that are called poorly bounded problems, or problems where you really can't get a lot of data. Things about, the future of the automobile or the future of the computer and if you say, yeah, I was much more creative as a child, 25% of you say, yeah, I was a little bit more creative when I was a kid. So 75% of you are thinking maybe today something isn't quite as good as it used to be when you were 5 or 6 or 7 or whenever you decided you were a child. And about 24, 25% of you are saying, no, I think today I'm more creative. It'd be interesting to dive into what that means for people, but I think in general when I've done this poll in lots of different seminars and lots of different workshops, it breaks down about the same way. About, 70, 80% of the people say, yeah, I feel like something is missing in me today that I had as a kid. When I was a child, I was 5 or 6 or 7, and I was playing. I could invent magical worlds. I could, a rock could be a truck, and a stick could be a, sword, and I could invent almost any sort of solutions to any problems that I had. And I would argue that that is really, kind of the pure creativity that where many of us are born with. And then something happens, and mostly what happens is our education system, which promotes a massive fear of failure and a search for only one right idea. And then there's always, if you listen to David Kelly's talk, he talks about a friend of his growing up in Ohio, and they were in art class in first or second grade, and they were making stuff out of clay, and he made a horse, and the girl next to him said, "That doesn't look like a horse. That's a horrible horse." And of course, his creativity at that point was crushed because what he felt, was a beautiful thing had been judged to be not art. So probably many of us had that experience where somebody told us, hey, you're not creative, or you're not an artist, or you can't write, or you can't sing, whatever it was. And, because again, there's a lot of evidence that says if you choose from your first idea or your second idea or just a few ideas, you're typically choosing in a very small and very confined problem space. But if you step back and brainstorm, ideate, mind map, do morphological analysis, do improv, do lots of other techniques that we teach, you're going to generate a very rich field of potential solutions, and from there you will choose potentially better and more innovative solutions. So how do we become great ideators? Or in another way of looking at it is, like, why is this even a problem? What is this whole thing about creativity? People talk a lot about creativity and innovation. They talk a lot about sort of a lack of new ideas in the business world today. And certainly as the environment changes and the external circumstances changes, either for yourself or for the organizations you work in, people are being asked to come up with new solutions and be creative, which is kind of like your track coach saying, run faster. How the heck do you do that, right? So what is this creativity problem anyway? The ability to transcend traditional ideas and create meaningful new ideas is one definition. So I'd like to just sort of dive into this a little bit, but before we do that, I want to take a quick poll. Here's a slide. And then my question to you is, were you more creative as a child than, let's say, you are today? However you want to judge creativity, whatever it means to you, were you more creative as a child than you are today? Okay. Looks like we're sort of stabilized here. We have about 270 people voting. You want to close the poll? Okay, looks like about half of you, 49%, or the smartphone. There's no way to really look into the future and get data. So you need to use other techniques. We talk about ourselves not solving problems or making decisions, but rather building our way forward. So we use prototyping for rapid learning and improvement. And we use lots and lots of different ways to solve problems because we believe if you're choosing from a small set of solutions, you'll choose poorly. But if you choose from a large set, which is what we're going to be talking about in terms of your personal creativity, you have a better chance of having a good outcome. Actually, we won't talk that much about the empathy phase, but that's really what unlocks innovation in some ways more than anything else in our process, because design thinking is really not only an approach to problem solving, it's an approach to problem finding. Most of the time, people are working on the wrong problem in our experience. And so we find that the highest leverage in innovation is sort of in reframing what the problem is actually about, and that's where we use our empathic observations and ethnography techniques and prototyping techniques to provoke a real understanding of the latent needs involved in whatever problem we're working on. And then, we think it's a pretty much a new perspective on how you create value either for yourself or in an organization. It's this co-creation process focused on real user needs, and it's a very human-centered process. So typically, the solutions that come out of it are not only innovative, but pretty action-driven or action in the world-driven. So, as I said, that's an overview of design thinking. But today, I really want to focus on this ideate bubble, or a hexagon, I guess, in this case. And ideation covers all of the techniques we use to have lots and lots and lots of ideas. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to today's presentation on training yourself to be more creative, a design thinking seminar. Again, I'm Bill Burnett, the Executive Director of the Design Program, and I want to walk you through what I think are sort of the three easiest ways to train yourself to be more creative. There's one of the writers in the creativity field for years and years and years is a guy named Edward de Bono, and I love this expression: you can't dig a new hole by digging an old one deeper. And so what we're going to do is teach you to dig some new holes. Design thinking, just to give you a little bit of a background, started here at Stanford. We've been teaching design in this integrated program between the art and the engineering schools for about 50 years exactly this year. 1963 was the first time the Board of Trustees at Stanford granted us permission to give out a degree, which was a joint degree between engineering and art. And so we've been exploring this multidisciplinary field for quite a long time. And one of the graduates of this program and one of our sort of, famous guys is David Kelly. He's both the founder of IDEO, probably the world's, foremost innovation consulting firm, and a professor here at Stanford, where he also founded our new design institute. Well, new, it's now 6 years old, the D School. And if you have an opportunity, go check out David's TED Talk on creative confidence. The link is there. But if you just Google David Kelly TED Talk, you'll get his talk on creative confidence. And he's quoted as saying, design thinking is all about unlocking potential and creating creative confidence in our students.